So it's with great pleasure that I welcome tonight's speaker, Alex Jan, who's chair of Central District Alliance.
Delighted to be here. It's an enormous subject, as Lucy has already made out. What I'd like to do is really do a few things, if I may. Is one, sort of try and answer the question: why on earth should we be talking about how Central London is governed right now? A little bit just to remind us. Many of you will know what we mean by Central London, the heart. A little bit of an exploration as to what makes it different, I would argue so different from other parts of the city and indeed the country and many other parts of the world. Some of the challenges and then some ideas for change around how we may tackle the issue of governance and related matters. But before I do that, I just wanted to read you something. This comes from a document that was prepared a while ago. I just wanted to read you something as a bit of a scene setter. It's called London's Image. It's by a man called Colin J. Davis. And his preamble is, problem, what problem? Imagine yourself a German prospective customer visiting the Confederation of British Industry at Centre Point, where I used to work. You have missed the courtesy limousine from Heathrow and have made your own way by tube. You emerge at Tottenham Court Road Station. It is raining. What you see in simply crossing over to the CBI may give you such negative conclusions about the British attention to detail that your hosts in their elegant boardroom will find it hard to dispel. What the visitor would notice, we take for granted. Centre Point itself is one of the better known buildings of the 60s, fashionable at the time and certainly considered. Its surroundings have had little consideration. Immediately to the south is the exposed flank of a structure partly demolished 30 years ago to make way for a new road. Now, like a remnant of built-in bomb damage, it is covered with hoardings. In front is a collection of railings, broken bollards, discarded traffic cones, abandoned plastic crates, anonymous cabinets covered in fly posters, an impoverished plywood newsstand, litter bins of different colours and repair, and a variety of coloured and styled telephone kiosks. The one relieving feature, though it takes an expert to spot, is the spire of St. Giles's Church just visible above the decay. The whole scene is certainly not unusual. Take a ride from the West End out towards an airport and you will see similar sights. The lasting impression our visitor takes with him could be his last view of seeming neglect. Now, that was written in 1991, and it was the Department for the Environment report with the London Planning Advisory Committee and J.C. Dussault, of all people. Now, the reality is, of course, that area is much better today than it was back in 1991, but only relatively recently. And there are still many aspects of what was described there which I still think are resonant 35 years later, nearly. So I just wanted to use that as a little bit of scene setting. Okay, so why should we be talking about governing London, governance of Central London right now? Well, contextually, this picture is from 1965, rather pretty really, but it's 61 years, I think, since the boroughs were created. A quarter of a century since TfL and the GLA where the Act was passed, and they came into existence roughly 25 or so years. There's a lot of local government reform outside of London, as we all know, controversial in certain cases, and indeed reform to policing, and generally speaking, a reduction in the number of authorities in both cases. And that does raise the question as to whether or not, if London looks increasingly odd compared to the rest of the country, is London potentially next? The civil service is sort of mind-eye. Now, in that period, much has clearly changed. So we've seen change in our economic structure, big shift away from manufacturing to the service sector, knowledge-intensive business services. We've seen changes in employment. Numbers have gone up massively, which is changes in population, transport policy and infrastructure. Global warming as an issue has become very real and present and a big factor in the way in which decisions around buildings and the built environment are made. And we've also seen London's emergence as a world city. The other thing that we know is that there is continuous pressure on public service provision and local government resources, particularly paradoxically in the more prosperous parts of the city as well as the less well off. And that's been really reinforced by the government's recent Fair Funding Review 2.0, which will see authorities such as Westminster and indeed the city not only see nearly all their business rates income used elsewhere, but also a reduction in their grant levels over time. And then the other thing we know is that the sort of the tensions, as Lucy has alluded to, some of the economic tensions and other tensions between central London and elsewhere, and between central London's various functions persist. Those things haven't gone away. And then looking forward, we've got more challenges on the horizon. So we've got a growth and productivity problem, which is not unique to central London, but is quite profound in central London, particularly amongst historically our best performing sectors. We've seen a degree of globalisation retreat, upon which London arguably did very well. So we've seen Brexit, we've seen a reduction in skilled immigration amongst other forms. The whole situation with the US means that globalisation is generally in a less good place than it was. And we've also seen the advance of competitor cities. So while all these things have been going on in London and to London, some of them have clearly affected other cities, but we've seen in some cases, certainly until recently, the Gulf does offer us some examples to look at, but we've seen Singapore, Hong Kong, plus or minus, Paris, Dubai, and elsewhere sort of being advancing on the stage over this period of time, along with New York. And of course, the latest thing we've got now is AI coming along, which Lord knows how that's going to disrupt our understanding of growth, productivity, employment in the high-skilled, high-paid sectors. And finally, the relationship between London and the rest of the UK is also something which continues to be challenging. So those are the sort of assembly of reasons which I think can help justify why we should be talking about how we sort of govern central London and why it's important to think about how we could do things better. Forgive those of you in the room who are familiar with this map, Charles, Tony and Matt and Richard and Andrea amongst others. But I do think it's important just for us to sort of have a little bit of a fix on what we mean by central London. And this is a very helpful piece of analysis done by Arup for the London Property Alliance, for whom I do some work. And it really just shows the remarkable fact that central London, which we'll come on to in a bit more detail in a moment, is made up of this whole array of parts of the boroughs that were consolidated and created back in 1965. So something around, in terms of area, Islington is about 16%. Of course, the city is 100% included. Westminster lion's share is in there. And some of the other boroughs have varying amounts within the CAS Plus, as we call it. I'm also going to include Canary Wharf, the Northern Ireland of Dogs, in our definition, because it's got more in common with central London than perhaps any other part of the city. And I think the thing to observe here is A, how those proportions vary, but B, this really remarkable fact from Centre for London's research on this similar subject back in 2020, which is that 85% of the residents to which these local authorities are accountable live outside of this area. So entirely logically, entirely understandably, if you are a councillor making decisions about Lambeth or Southwark or some of these other boroughs, you will be mindful of the fact that most of your residents live outside of these areas, and that will inevitably affect the choices that are made within those areas, if they are, and whether or not they are to the benefit of the rest of the borough, perhaps more than they are to other parts of central London, for example. I know you'll know these factors, but again, I think it's important to contextualise the problems and what we might or might not be able to do to address them. So this is a tiny, tiny piece of real estate, to use the language. It's about 13.5 square miles. So it's 2% of London by area. And yet, as we'll see, its economic importance is remarkably high. We talked about how it's referred to in planning terms. It's home to about 350,000 residents. So again, very modest number of the total for London as a whole. And if you include TfL, which is technically a local authority, and the New Oxford Street Development Corporation, and the GLA, I think you get up to about 13 local authorities, all having some locus or jurisdiction in this tiny little area. Before we get onto the economic impact that the area has, of course, it is the centre of ceremonial London, of the country ceremonially, in terms of its political power, its administrative government, and indeed legal authority. And despite some of the government's ambitions on the civil service, for example, just to take one element of that, number of civil servants in London is now higher than it was 4 or 5 years ago, despite attempts to move them out. We know that it's also an area with very high income and very low income and high deprivation amongst the resident population. And it's also this major centre of economic activity and, importantly, of money for the Treasury. Whatever we think about whether or not the government should take the money, it is a fact that, as we'll see, that it is a cash generator for the government, and it helps the government to balance the books, amongst other things. So in economic terms, the other things that make this tiny area, 13 square miles or so, different is this huge economic hive of activity that takes place. So we're talking about half of London's economic activity. 98% covers the rest of it, and it's 12% of UK output. So it's not, I think, Matt, it's 0.001% of the UK's landmass, producing 12% of UK output, and around 2.2 million jobs. And as I mentioned before, in tax terms, it's probably, on a prorated basis, it's probably producing half of the fiscal surplus for London. So that's the difference between how much tax London generates and pays and how much is received back from the system. And it's probably more than 20 billion, but we'll go with 20 for now. And it also produces half of London's business rate yield of 5 billion out of 10 billion, which is about 20%, I think, of England's total. And that was pre the Fair Funding Review that I mentioned earlier. It's also a place where, you know, of the 21 million international visitors who come to the UK, loads of them come through London. I can't remember the figures now, but it may be 80% of our German businessman and his erstwhile compatriots. So it is the gateway for all of these people who are piling into the country. And indeed, as we know from other research by Centre for London and others, it's the gateway for investment, not only into London, but to the rest of the country. So it's performing a global city function as well as being home to the residents and collection of villages and so forth. And I would argue that that global status, this concept of the global city, adds an extra layer of complexity and difference to meeting and managing the needs of the area. And we know that, you know, the global city concept is something which only really emerged in the 1990s. And some work that Tony and I did for some of the bids, this is actually Tony's quote, not mine, but what the hell. You know, what's so interesting is that it was never designed to be this way. It was never, we kind of look at it and it kind of half looks curated in terms of its economic functionality, you could say. But I just thought this is a great quote, which is Central London was simply the fortuitously created agglomeration of public buildings, museums, galleries, offices, shops, transport and concert halls, markets, homes and restaurants, roads, monuments, cathedrals, exhibition halls, and people who existed in today's scans. It was not deliberately created. And in a way, that makes it absolutely remarkable. But it also means that there are aspects to the way in which it has evolved and is governed, which don't really fit, perhaps, with promoting and preserving its best interests. And by the way, I'm not saying other cities are necessarily designed to be global. Or places like Dubai arguably are, and Singapore, and they've kind of had a bit of a mixed bag at achieving that. But more like New York and Paris, it is definitely a relatively new thing in the history of the city to be thought of as global, with all the benefits and disadvantages that brings. So now we're getting on to the part which I can talk from with authority, which is some of the challenges. And I know that there are lots of challenges facing the Central Activity Zone. Some of them, which were listed in the excellent work by Centre for London, included the fact we've got pressure on space, we've got obviously competing demands for use. We've seen the changing nature of work. We've seen, that work was actually done probably just before home working, before COVID kicked in. But that's created even more of an issue in terms of how you get people into the office and so forth. We've seen the extent to which London's population turns over more quickly, which is associated with some forms of immigration, higher education, and so forth. And as I mentioned before, inequality and deprivation are challenges, along with environmental factors to do with things like air quality and global warming and the need for shading and so forth. So there is, we could spend all night on the problems, and you'll be relieved to know that not only am I not going to do that, but I've just picked three which I wanted to use to try and dig into what I think are good examples, good challenges of how we do things currently to provide food for thought as to how we might do things differently going forward. So the first one is around the public realm. A subject that Lucy and I know and love well because we're involved in that world, the built environment world, as many of you are. And my point here is really that, again, you might say we don't want it, but the reality is that the pressure of all those workers and all those visitors means that the strain placed on the public realm is relentless. And the picture I couldn't find for you because it's too late at night and I couldn't find it, but it was a picture of a newly planted tree that had been snapped over. So we're going to have to deal with the four pictures we've got here, which are a legible London sign, a waste bin in a park, a couple of phone boxes, and a street light that doesn't work. And these are all pictures that I've taken, sadly, as part of my attempt to sort of cajole various local authorities into fixing things. But these are, as with our friend from 1991, these are part of today's literal landscape in central London that, despite all this wealth and activity, form part of the landscape. And that is partly because the pressure to remarkably, the amount of damage that goes on in terms of the sort of enmity towards anything from the state, as we see in Paris to a certain extent, it's just there. So lots of things get broken and stolen and smashed up or left in disrepair. And the system really struggles to keep on top of that. We also know that competing demands for space creates tensions between users. So, noise, licensing issues, residential requirements, hotels, offices, all those things, they all place demand on the public realm and create tensions between uses. And I would argue also that those boundaries that we saw with our different sort of local authorities of various types, those 13 local authorities, they add to the complexity of dealing with these challenges. So whether it's getting something fixed, whether it's dealing with noise from across a borough boundary, whether it's the resurfacing of a road, whether it's diverting traffic for one problem in one part of a borough and the knock-on effect it has in another one. Those are all, I think, we can reasonably assign those sorts of problems in part to the administrative arrangement for the way in which central London is managed and organised. And the other point, because of the remarkably centralised nature of the way in which local government is funded, means that resources available for dealing with these sorts of things are just overwhelmed by other demands. And we know that local authorities will typically spend 70 or 80% of their income on providing important services that are never seen by the people who pay their business rates, for example. So the whole adult social care, child social care programs, all those things which are very, very important, are paid for as such a big part of the tax base that businesses pay, either in London, spent in London or elsewhere in the country, that effectively the amount of resource that's available for these sorts of things is incredibly limited. And the other issue I'd just touch on is the extent to which we have a one-size-fits-all problem with regulatory. So, the issues facing dealing with problems in the street in London, and maybe some other big cities, are very, very different from dealing with problems in residential areas. And yet the regulatory framework for dealing with roadworks and reinstatements are the same here as they are in the countryside. So some of the challenges in the public realm. And then the roads. Don't really talk about roads that much for various reasons, not in fashion. But the other thing I wanted to reflect on is this. If we look at the product of all the policy decisions and investments that have been made, many of which in their own terms would be desirable, and I understand that. The fact is that the outcome of some of those, that collection of decision making, which may be all defensible and rational in their own terms, has been that bus speeds are now at an all-time low. So central London bus speeds are now around 7 miles an hour. And it is actually about 40% lower than it was before the congestion charge was introduced, right? So we're told the congestion charge was about speeding up traffic, including that for buses, let's say. But we've now seen a big reduction in bus speeds, all-time low. And alongside that, we've also seen a big reduction in traffic. So somehow we've managed to reduce traffic, but we've also slowed down one of the most important means by which we get people from poorer outer London areas into work into central London. It's an observation. How we've arrived at it, we can talk about. But the other thing we know is that roadworks, which are a big part of the problem, I would argue are now largely out of control. So we don't have numbers for the central London area, but we know that there's about 400,000 sets of roadworks in London as a whole last year, according to TfL figures. And in central London, as you know, there are huge numbers of those that go on. And you just get the impression that until, even though the steps that are happening are relatively late, we'll come on to that, but you get the impression that those sorts of problems just exist, and the capacity and ability of government in its various forms with all these different authorities to tackle it in a meaningful way has been very, very limited. And on the point, coming back to bus speeds and various other things, it is a fact, I think, that when one borough, despite all the traffic modelling that goes on in the TfL system, that often, and you might say this is anecdotal, but I think it's more than that given what's happened to speeds, one borough's excellent public realm scheme may well be another borough's traffic problem. And where reform does take place, it's very, very slow to secure. So if we think about hire bike regulation and, line bikes have to stop at the borough, at geofence borough boundary from one borough to another, pedicab regulations taking 10 years to get that into situ. And then roadworks, we're just seeing the boroughs in central London now charging for lane rental after TfL has been doing it for a long time. Some of these interventions, which I think are entirely rational and the right ones to make, just take an incredibly long time. And I think that does reflect the dynamic of the governance arrangement and the fact there is no collective authority or voice for this area with these unique pressures and demands to be able to promote and push that stuff through. There's no one sort of providing that husbandry, and as a result it takes forever to get anything from our one-size-fits-all policies changed for central London. And the third challenge I wanted to just sort of bring up, which is sort of zooming out a bit, is what has happened in terms of development associated with the Elizabeth line. And those of you who've been around the block long enough will remember that when the Elizabeth line case for funding was put together, the part of the case was, and this involved businesses helping to pay for it, was that it should be a catalyst for growth. It should be something which would help with productivity gains. It would deepen and widen labour markets. It would lead to land use change, and it would therefore strengthen the London economy. And what's remarkable, I think, about what we've seen is that in the period in the run-up and just to the opening of the Elizabeth line, we've seen a reduction in office space in the areas, some of the areas that were designed or programmed to benefit from it most. So in the case of Westminster, there's been a loss of 7 million square feet in office space over that 5-year period, 2018 to 23. Now, in the case of the city, that picture is A, turning around, and B, is a slightly more complicated one in terms of buildings that were demolished and buildings that were in progress. But overall, over that 5-year period, we've seen quite a dramatic loss of space in the very areas that we thought of the CAS that would be benefiting from the Elizabeth line and therefore helping to grow the economy. And if we look at this another way, you look at major applications that go into these local authorities, you'll see that over this, in this case, 10-year period, 2013 to 2023, there was a 75% reduction in the City of Westminster, 53 in Tower Hamlets, and so on and so on. At a time when we should have been thinking about how do we harness the benefits of the Elizabeth line. And I think the fact that Londoners, through the fare box, and London businesses will end up probably paying for 70% of it, and the fact we haven't been able to sort of benefit from the growth as a city, and indeed because of fiscal devolution, we don't grow our own tax base to address some of the problems that all of this growth and activity causes, is particularly galling for those who worked on Crossrail. And as the work by Knight Frank for London Property Alliance concluded, the contraction of office space has constrained the ability of London, or the line rather, to drive productivity gains. And as we know, productivity question is a huge issue, which interestingly, central government is now more interested in than it has been before. Okay, so I'm nearly there, you'll be pleased to know. Some ideas for change. Okay, now some of these are a bit wishy-washy, because I'm a bit scared of being over assertive about sort of jumping in with both feet to say we need to sort of burn everything down, so to speak, and start again. But I do think, maybe we need to firm up our objectives around employment and growth and planning and development for whoever is involved in governing the CAS. And also, as Centre for London mentioned, we could probably do with a more sort of unified voice for central London, which would require high levels of collaboration between central government, because they're a big player in all of this, the GLA, the boroughs, the BIDs, civic societies, London Society represented here this evening, business groups, and other things that affect central London. And of course, residents, not to be forgotten, also form part of that dynamic. And then the other thing is, and a number of us have had meetings with government recently, which give us sort of room for optimism, remarkably, but a reform to fiscal and planning rules to incentivise growth and development. So at the very least, some of the growth in the tax base that new development creates is retained. And of course, and with that money, we could then deal with many of the, hopefully many of the sort of the issues around grot and squalor that I identified before. And then the final one, which of course is the most difficult, is thinking about some sort of, which is meant to be the exam question for the presentation, is how do we change, do we need to change, and if so, how do we change the governance settlement for this area so that, to use civil service speak, it is fit for the future. So, I guess there are various options, right? We could envisage a world in which the GLA had a more powerful role. So obviously we have the London plan, but the reality is that I think the GLA is quite wary about telling local authorities their plans are non-compliant. I mean, if you look at the spread of the difference in plans for the boroughs in the CAS, from Westminster or K&C, better example, in the west through to Tower Hamlets in the east, and the fact they are all compliant with the London plan on growth and employment and all the rest of it is, shows that it's a very, very broad church in terms of what the London plan will sort of tolerate or accept as part of the mix of borough plans under the aegis of the London plan in relationship to the CAS. But so maybe there's a tightening up there, and maybe they could do more on highways to avoid the problem of congestion where we now have very little traffic and all the rest of it. I don't know. Perhaps we could have a sort of committee of borough leaders for the CAS area, plus the city, of course, chaired by the mayor, and that could deal with the governance functions and some of the public services that we've talked about. I mean, all the boroughs doing the right thing in their own terms are in a world in which they are providing public services in the centre of London, the heart of London, which stop and turn around at the road, right, at the junction. Sort of like East Berlin, West Berlin. So Veolia in Camden and Veolia in Westminster come up to Charlotte Street, and woe betide if the machine with the things that go around is still switched on when it comes into Camden. Penalty fares all round, really. So there's something around, perhaps we could do something there. Others have postured the idea of a reduction in the number of authorities, and Restate have done some recent work on that, which is this idea of knocking the boroughs into 2s and 3s. So having boroughs of around 1 million in size rather than 250 to 400,000. The risk with that is that you would end up with even deeper boundaries between parts of the central activity zone if they are not in their own borough. So the risk with that is you then have severely entrenched borough boundaries which stretch all the way out to Barnet and the M25 in some cases. I mean, another idea is to have another Royal Commission. The Royal Commission of 1957 to 1960 led to the current, the borough components of the current arrangement. But my word of caution from Professor Travers is this, which is, as he says, reorganisation is almost always a way of giving the impression a policy problem is being solved when generally there is no evidence of link between reorganisation and solving whatever the problem is. Now, I'm arguing against myself here, but I think I kind of feel, as we'll see in my last slide now, in fact, that is the last, one more to go. But, I just wonder whether or not we really, this time, we do need to do something about the governance without burning it all down. Apparently we can now all be segmented into people who burn everything down, sort of Trump style, or we want to reform and evolve organisations. So it's my only word of warning, because instinctively the desire would be just to say rip it all out and start again, but it's problematic. So just to conclude, this area, this beating heart, however you want to describe it, is a very, very unusual place, as hopefully I've articulated, given its scale and impact and contribution. And it's only really comparable to a handful of other places. Probably New York City is its only comparator in reality, Paris to a certain extent. It makes this hugely disproportionate contribution to the UK, in cultural, in educational, healthcare, all these other terms, but also fiscally and economically. And that, I think, that penny has finally dropped with the Treasury, because if it doesn't perform, it prevents the Treasury from using the fiscal surplus to keep a bit of a lid on borrowing and indeed to bankroll the rest of the country. And the risk is that its contribution will fall if we don't tackle the productivity issues we've talked about, which are in part a function of the planning system in the way I've described, which is in part a function of the governance arrangements. And paradoxically, despite all of this wealth, I mean, if ever there was a place for Galbraith's, public squalor, private affluence, we found it. Because remarkably, despite being a well-off part of the country, we still somehow struggle to meet many of the central London area's very basic needs and the more strategic ones. And I accept that some of these are new. Phone snatching is relatively new, but then Dickensian crime has been in central London. People having their watches nicked and fenced through Hatton Garden has probably been going on for at least 150 years. So some of these problems are new, some of them are long-standing. And I think it's also true to say that tensions will always exist between the functions of central London. But the big challenge, I think, is how to meet the needs of central London as a place in its own right. And I think we fail to think about central London in those terms. So, the risk is that central London is a place that we're either trying to get people into, for example, from the suburbs, or where we turn our buses around because we're trying to get people into the centre. Or it's a very local place. It's about the very local needs of a particular neighbourhood through excellent traffic calming and all the rest of it. But the knock-on effects of that to other parts of the centre, I don't think are fully appreciated or recognised as being problematic. And indeed, the policing of London, I avoided policing of London, but the fact that we have an operational boundary between Westminster and Camden in policing terms, with a tiny neighbourhood team for Camden, as if it was a sort of very small town in Bedfordshire or something, I just think is a remarkable way of providing public services and governing them in this amazing area. So the concept of dealing with central London as a place in its own right, I think, is a very important, powerful one. And then finally, some of this stuff may not be palatable, but there is a risk that if we don't come up with ideas for change and reform, then others might do that. And those might not be very good, but they also might be imposed by others upon us. Thank you very much.
Alex, Matt Dillon from both HS2 Limited and from Central District Alliance. That was a fascinating talk about what goes on behind the curtain, I guess, how some of the problems that are visible might be caused by some of the machinations in the background. I think despite Tony's quote about none of it ever doing anyone any good. And it was a real call to action. I'm interested in the other side of the coin. What do you think is actually working well at the moment in terms of London's government and that we should preserve or enhance going forward? And if that's too hard, or if there's nothing, what works well elsewhere? What's working well in New York, Paris, Dubai, etc., that we should probably learn from?
So I think it's a great question. I think the fact that despite the headline stuff around phone snatching and everything, I think the fact London is a remarkably safe city is something which we should be mindful of. That's a huge asset, and the phone thing is a terrible, very visible distraction from the fundamental safety of the city. London's murder rate is a quarter of New York's, and New York's is at a 40-year low. But compared to other places, other cities, I think the sort of general sense of safety and well-being, and always room for improvement, I think that's a great strength. I think the fact that it is a bit of a freewheeling city, I mean, I'm going to contradict all the things I'm complaining about, but the fact that it is a city where, you generally, it is freewheeling, it's porous, it's, Janan Ganesh had a brilliant piece about London. All the right people hate London because London is liberal and progressive. So I think the fact that people can feel comfort, be themselves, all that stuff is another great strength. And I think the fact that we dodged the great road building extravaganzas, which did untold damage to some of our British cities and those further afield, is an amazing strength. And that is actually a footnote as a warning against, having, I'm not suggesting any authority would ever want to build an urban motorway box again, but it is, we have to be careful about how powerful our institutions are that we create, because if they make errors, they will make those errors on a very big scale. So those are a few thoughts in terms of some of the strengths. I mean, the other thing is just the richness and the variety of the arts and the culture and the green stuff, all the things that make London, central London, just feel very human in scale. And its history, the history of the buildings. Yes, we want to build new stuff, but there's a lot that has been built that you'd never want to really see go away. And those things give it character and interest and make it a more attractive place to live and invest.
I have a question which is maybe about, I think all of what you've discussed is super interesting and worth continuing to discuss and worth addressing. And but sometimes I wonder if the answer is where we think it is. and maybe following on from what Matt was posing, what can we learn from other places? I think maybe Paris was experiencing similar problems in the 1970s and 80s, where the city was growing really rapidly and draining people and away from other regions. And the way that the French government addressed that was high-speed rail links between the regional cities to Paris and to each other. And that's taken 40 years, I guess. But what it's done is helped build the power of the regional cities and removed from Paris the need to provide all the new schools and all the new hospitals and all the new roads and all the new services, and it's helped build the economies across the whole country. So I wonder if the question, I mean, I think all of what you're asking still needs to be addressed, and we can't rely on things outside of London, but it feels to me if we're talking big picture questions, which I think you're posing, that we also have to think about HS2 and other mobility connectivity.
Would you like me to try and respond?
Yes,
I mean, as a Liverpool boy, coming to London 38 years ago, now what I always think of as, forgive me, this the sort of birth canal of the West Coast Main Line and dropped into Euston, and coming from a city, which was the old joke, they used to ask everybody, where's the second city of empire? And everybody else, when they went to Manchester and Birmingham and Leeds, said Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, and they went to Liverpool and they said London. I understand the temptation to sort of, I'm not saying being nostalgic, because you're not saying that, but to sort of, of course we need to look at how London relates to the rest of the economy for no other reason than the politics of it, because of the damage to sort of our sort of collective view of ourselves and everything else that might create. But I mean, just in terms of central London's population is way lower than it was historically. I mean, I think at one point it was 1 million people, and we're now down to sort of 3. So just in terms of central London, I think there's opportunity for growth. I mean, on high-speed rail, I think what I would say is, I'd say you can kind of, I understand why big countries like France and Germany and Spain need high-speed rail networks. Britain had the fastest non-high-speed railway in the world, 125 mile an hour line speed in the 1970s. I think that we can achieve some of the objectives we want to by not necessarily building any more high-speed railway lines.
Westminster Council. Thanks, Alexander. Fascinating. Really enjoyed the presentation. I'm interested if you've any thoughts on the overnight visitor levy, and whether you think there's a place for that in here somewhere, generating funds that could fix some of this.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, coming back to Matt's question about, well, what do other people do better? I mean, in terms of the way these things are organised, I think not having subject to all the other complaints and concerns about how much businesses are taxed and the sort of leisure sector and hotels and so forth, I do think that there is merit in an overnight visitor levy, but really only if it's spent on some of the things that I was talking about. I think if it's spent on providing housing in outer London boroughs, I think that's very, very problematic. So I think a reasonable levy, which is spent on things which would directly impact on a lot of the factors that affect our German tourists. And today, some of the things I showed, more policing and better lighting and looking after things and cleaning them and sweeping up, I think fundamentally is a good thing. However, it has to be at the right level. So the right sort of institutions have to get the money to deliver those things. And it mustn't be taken away by central government through the equalisation process when they do their 3-year or so review of how much money a local authority gets. So it has to be genuinely additional to work as well.
Sorry about the presentation, it's great. I suppose the one thing I was curious whether an effort was made is in formulating some goals and objectives. There are so many great minds in organizations, and by the sound of it, all of them see the challenges. And so I suppose, would it help try to identify some of the goals that perhaps could then guide on what the best governance model is? Just if you take a model of an entity that is having a strategy, sometimes you then apply the setup once you have those goals identified, right?
Yeah, I think that's a very good challenge and a great idea. I mean, at the moment, the Mayor has an annual performance report, I think, which probably very few people, apart from some of us, read, which attempts to look at some of the key indicators in the way that you perhaps described. I think that, and in fact, there's a sort of, I think there has to be also a report on congestion charging revenue and how it's spent, because it's meant to be hypothecated to dealing with transport issues. It's amazing how that money's ended up in things which have slowed traffic down, but that's another story. And I think that having, without becoming sort of overly directive, I think, having more interest, more curiosity, which has been increasing in recent years with London Growth Plan and various other things, but looking at, and indeed that contains targets, but yes, having a broader suite of targets on things like economic growth, productivity, which sectors do we want to do well, without overdoing it, without backing too many horses and all the rest of it. Having a bit more of that would be a very good thing. I think the way you get people interested in that, politicians interested in that at a London level, is by there being a reward associated with those things happening. And the big problem we've got at the moment is that central London boroughs could allow a huge amount of development to go up, and once the 106 monies are gone, that's it. They get nothing long term. And residents, understandably, because they want a quiet life, or they don't want to be disturbed, or want the area to remain the same, are their voters, and those people are often very wary or oppose change. So yes, let's have more targets, but A, let's not go crazy with them. They mustn't become an end in themselves. But B, we have to create the incentives to then help politicians to make decisions designed to meet them.
I was intrigued, or am intrigued, by the last note in your presentation. I wonder if you can put it up again. But my take on it, my memory, well, there it is. I'm wondering who exactly is the London you're talking about, and who are the others that you're referring to? I guess from your presentation, London is CAS, defined in one way or other.
Well,
So I'm struggling to. I'm struggling to get into that.
Okay.
What's how do we establish what this London entity is?
Sure.
and we all perhaps have very different views on what that is. And certainly I'd suggest a lot of the boroughs within CAS would have a very different view. But then I'm intrigued by the others, well, please.
So let's sort of work it backwards. I think as I was kind of trying to join some dots earlier, but I think London's setup will look increasingly odd compared to what's gone on in the rest of the country. And from the civil service point of view, that probably will generate curiosity, right? Oh, we've done this outside of London. Surely we should, because civil service has to have advice ministers and have a work programme, and you've got to have reform and all the rest of it. So that's where I'm coming from here. That civil service might just decide that we need fewer police services in London because we've now got fewer police services elsewhere, or we need smaller number of authorities. So that's where that's coming from. And you might say imposed is too strong a word, and I accept that. But if the idea gains momentum there, and once it gains speed and it becomes a political project at a national level, I think it's quite hard to stop. So that's my sort of slight concern with it. And well, by London, I suppose, what do I mean? I mean, in some ways, I do mean the borough leaders, and I do mean City Hall, and I also mean us. I don't mean that in a sort of slightly fantasy way, but you could imagine a world in which London councils and business and others, residents' organisations. Andrea and I were at the London Forum last week talking about some of these issues. So I've still got 4 fingers on my hand. We could bring these people together and we could go through some of what the problems are, what people would like to see change, and see if we could come up with an idea around the governance issue. And yes, I focused very much on the centre, but given the impact the centre has on all parts of London in some shape or form, providing access to so many of the services and economic activity and good things in life it provides, I wouldn't mind that being cast as a wider London net. I accept it's difficult, but then the alternative might be the status quo, which I think is problematic, or indeed that others make decisions for London without necessarily being part of London in the way those institutions are.
Supplementary.
Yes.
Of course you can.
Who or what would be the engine producing this London view? Because I still see lots
London
of.
councils would be a good place to start. So a combination of
But
the
something
boroughs.
new needs to be established to get that dialogue going.
Well, I think something as a process. I mean, you could have a London Commission. It wouldn't be a royal commission, but you could do something like a London Commission on a voluntary basis with those parties. And it wouldn't be a permanent institution. It would be designed to try and answer these questions and produce another report, which could then be used to guide or encourage the government, because ultimately this is a governmental decision, right? To guide them in terms of the sorts of changes we want to see.
I like the idea of some sort of committee of leaders, and Darren Rodwell has spoken at some length about something along those lines. But it seems to me there's a difference between the idea of having a sort of club, which you sort of mentioned, of the equivalent to associations of bids, perhaps, to governance reform.
Yeah.
And so that governance reform would therefore require the collaboration of the Corporation of London. And you may remember, of course, in 1835, Tony will correct me if I'm wrong, 1854, 1888, they turned down any association with any other boroughs. And so are you suggesting that they might actually lose their rights given to them by King John, and therefore all the various things that the corporation is able to do that other local authorities aren't, and which at the moment they do want to hold on to quite strongly?
Yeah, for sure. And Tony will remind me, because there's been a great book that's just been written about the City of London, which I failed to attend the launch of, which talks about the city and how the city is beyond logic. I think, Tony, is that the quote?
It is. Well, it's a quote from the Royal Commission in 1960, which said, "Logic has its limits, and the city lies outside it."
So, I mean, you might say I'm ducking,
My
Peter,
Ian Doolittle.
but the the city is 1,000 years, whatever we're coming up to. City's pretty good at finding ways to evolve, adapt, demonstrate its value and contribution to the wider governance of London. I mean, interesting, many of the problems I've kind of identified, apart from bus speeds, the city's pretty good at managing them. So I'm not suggesting we should abolish the city. I think the city might be open to a degree of reform or change. I mean, as I understand it, it's already under pressure in some ways from central government in terms of some of the things it does and the way in which it's funded. So that pressure of change would potentially affect the city as much as anything else, which I think would create a strong incentive for them to want to think perhaps creatively and imaginatively about a London-led set of proposals to improve the way in which the CAS is looked after.
I'm Cynthia Grant. I'm a transport planner and I do public realm schemes. I worked at London Docklands, so a lot of the things you've said ring a bell. It seems to me incredibly persuasive to make an argument for doing something special for whatever you define as the central area. So I'm very taken with your thoughts on that. And it seems so obvious in some ways, however you define the area, that is there any evidence that the Mayor's Office or anyone in the GLA has given any thought to these things at all? At the moment they rely on TfL, which does have area-wide control, doesn't necessarily do a good job in terms of public realm stuff. It's driven by moving pedestrians and cyclists and whatever's the most fashionable thing to do. They've reduced bus speeds by taking massive capacity out of the network. So general traffic speeds have come down and as a result bus speeds have come down. So I'm very much in favour of a more incremental approach. So I like your committee, as Peter said, the idea of some sort of coordinated board, which rather than a big bang approach, so to do something collaboratively, initially to demonstrate a need would be maybe leading into something bigger. But is there any sign at the GLA that they've thought about these things?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is more interest in the central London area than there has been for a long time. And the London Growth Plan does reflect that. So that's, and that's one thing. I think whatever we think of it, the fact that we now have a development corporation along Oxford Street.
It should be bigger. I mean, if they've had that for a bigger area, it might do some of this
well,
job.
for sure. But it does suggest that there is interest in central London in that sense.
It's a whim, though. That one's a whim.
Well, it might be a whim, but it might not. I mean, let's see what they do on the planning side of the equation. And I think I come back to this issue of what's in it for them. And I think if their fiscal destiny in part was tied to how many buildings are occupied and going up and paying business rates in central London, and I know they kind of paid out business rates directly now, so the merry-go-round has been simplified a bit. I think, but if they had more retention incentive or growth incentives around business rates in particular, and the government could make it, I'm not suggesting the government does this, but the government could actually say part of your grant is contingent on you achieving some of the targets we were talking about before. So the government could be quite sort of assertive about this. I think politicians would naturally, as they do in New York, be more preoccupied about how the centres of their cities function.
The other two.
It's actually a really, really quick question. You said in Central Activity Zone or Central London, there's actually only 300,000 residents, but actually business-wise, there's a huge volume of business activity in there.
Yeah.
Would you maybe think that this body would maybe open up the voting system to allow businesses a greater democratic right and a greater stake in what happens in that zone?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I did think about it, and then I decided to not think about it. I mean, interestingly, if you look at these are the bids, right, in London, and there's a whole separate session which I promise not to give on bids at a future date. But it's interesting how much of the central activity zone is now covered in bids, and bids have for those of you who are not initiated, have a ballot system every 5 years. They have to go back to their businesses and renew their mandates. They then levy a mandatory tax, which is 100% hypothecated into their areas. And I don't think as currently the Treasury's managed to equalise that away. I think having systems of government where you merge business and voter representation, citizen representation is problematic. I think in Britain the political tradition is probably very wary of it. Now the city, as we've already, is beyond logic, but also has a voting system which is also arguably, unique, and indeed combines the two. But I would say I think you could probably achieve quite a lot without having to do that. Building on these institutions amongst others.
Was exactly the same question, so.
Oh, all right, great. So, Tony.
Quick observation as much as a question, which should save time a bit. It strikes me there's about to be political change potentially at the head of the country, and that might involve a former metropolitan mayor becoming prime minister. And I thought that person who arrives has been talking a lot about Manchesterism. He would realise that Manchesterism has actually been driven by Manchester City Council as much as by Greater Manchester as an entity, admittedly with a bit of Salford on the side. Just so people from Birmingham would realise that what good has happened in the West Midlands has been driven from Birmingham as a large unitary city central authority. So I wonder whether that's just going to create an opportunity, but also a little bit of a challenge, because if as is predicted on Monday, he comes down to the south and looks at London government, the new Prime Minister might, or the putative new Prime Minister might think this needs sorting itself out, whether it needs to be sorted out by civil service and government imposition, or whether it needs to be sorted out by the great and the good of London, the boroughs, the mayor, civil society coming together with saying, here's how you can actually drive productivity in this city by unlocking this Gordian knot, or letting us unlock it.
Yeah, and I think that the risk with this presentation, as with many of the presentations I give, is it's very heavy on problems and it's not that great on solutions, because solutions are hard, right? And the trouble with the sort of the risk associated with political change nationally is that we're good at articulating the problems so that they are then seized upon, but how do we then bring the rear of the pantomime horse through to say this is what we think we would like to see happen in order to address those changes. And the big risk is we get a policy, they get the problem and then they come up with a solution which we just think, I can't believe that you mentioned that, you came up with that. So but I agree with you, it's an issue.
I think one of the reasons Central London is, the first thing is Central London as an idea didn't really exist until the 1960s or 70s. With the coming of international tourism, international travel, global finance, the end of capital controls, Central London wasn't really identified as a thing until then. It was just the middle of London, which had a single municipality, the London County Council, running it. So planning, transport, streets were all run by a single authority, and it wasn't seen as the world city and all the things. Now, of course, that sits slightly complicatedly with the fact that many people who've never been to London, as a child, children will be doing this again soon after the social media ban. Oranges and lemons, say the bells of St Clement's, London bridges falling down, all these things, Guy Fawkes, Wordsworth, all of these things created an image of London, which people who've never been to London understand London as that. And even people in outer London and in the home counties would see London as the thing we're talking about. So it makes it much harder to govern for the people who live there than on the basis of residence as the basis of government. Because millions of people across the UK and beyond have an interest in this area, or have a knowledge of it, have an understanding of it. And I think in those terms, the argument for, and this was discussed by the Royal Commission in the late 50s and 60s, a slightly more obviously directive role for the city-wide government in the central area, which of course would change the behaviour of the boroughs within it. So I think that's the way of getting a dynamic to think about it more, because I think the boroughs would be more willing to work together if they thought the mayor was about to take decisions on their behalf. And I think somewhere in there lies the way of keeping all the benefits of the competitive and collaborative system that we have in central London, but and that's why the Oxford Street Development Corporation is so interesting. There's going to be another one at Euston, because it forces central London boroughs to think, do we want to have this done to us, or do we want to do it ourselves? I think that's bringing it all together is a way of sort of thinking about how important all of this is, but how difficult it is, given that this little area is known by people who've never been to it but feel they understand it.
There's nothing to add to that, is there?
I think that's a brilliant
Great way to
note
end.
on which to end, because I think everyone will agree we've thoroughly aired the issues, but at the same time we could go on with these very potent discussions for another 2 hours, but we're not going to. But another time, and Alex, come back and speak about this. We've actually got Nabil Khan, the Chief Executive of the Oxford Street Development Corporation, speaking here in late September. So we are continuing to talk about this, going beyond more superficial, ineffective reorganisation towards more evolutionary strategic change that everyone agrees with and believes in. That's the vision.
That's the
Anyway,
top-down
thank you
approach.
very much,
Great.
Alex.
My pleasure.
Brilliant.